Today's special episode of Socially Democratic is presented to you by Dunn Street. Dunn Street partners with businesses, organisations, unions and social democratic parties across the globe to develop community organising strategies and train leaders to build power from within their community. And in 2021, Dunn Street will continue to work with folks that want to share their stories, inspire others, take action, give hope and organise communities for change. To find out how you can partner with Dunn Street, hit us up at dunnstreet.com.au. Socially Democratic is also presented to you by Maurice Blackburn Lawyers. Are you passionate about building strong relationships and solving problems? Maurice Blackburn, Australia's leading plaintiff law firm, is looking for 2 union relationship organisers in Queensland and in Melbourne. Your responsibilities will include providing an exceptional service to union members and union clients by connecting them to the best legal staff across Maurice Blackburn's practice areas. The roles are based in Melbourne and in Queensland. And to apply, simply go to mauriceblackburn.com.au/careers. Be part of change and fight for fair and apply now. Hello, everyone, and welcome to a special episode of Socially Democratic, your weekly centre-left political and organising podcast that dives into the progressive campaigns and issues of the day and the people leading them from home and abroad. And on this week's particular episode, we are handing the reins over to Ryan Batchelor, the Executive Director from the McKell Institute here in Victoria. We've partnered with McKell for this particular podcast because Ryan has a good friend of Dunn Street on the show this week. He's going to be speaking to Zoe Daniel. Zoe Daniel was the former ABC Washington correspondent who was reporting from the United States all throughout the Trump presidency, and she's just written a book called Greetings from Trumpland, How an Unprecedented Presidency Changed Everything, which is an understatement. So Ryan sat down with Zoe this week at effectively a kind of a bit of a book launch, I guess, here in Melbourne at the Hill of Content, but also it was a live Zoom thing so folks from across the country could tune in and ask questions and whatnot. So we thought we'd get together and record it. And here's the takeaways from that conversation between Ryan and Zoe. Don't forget to subscribe to Socially Democratic on Apple Podcast, Spotify, Amazon and Stitcher. And if you're an Apple Podcast user, and this is the first time maybe you've listened to the podcast, please leave us a rating and give us a review because that always helps us promote the podcast, which means more people can find out about it and tune in. We want to get as many rusted on Social Democrats, Labor Party people here in Australia and across the globe to listen to the show because it helps us then get more good quality guests on like Zoe Daniel. And don't forget, for all the updates on the podcast, follow Dunn Street on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram and LinkedIn. Okay, let's get to today's episode.
Welcoming everyone, and I'd like to extend my welcome as well. Also to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land we're meeting on here tonight and pay my respects to elders past and present, and to acknowledge any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians joining us. We're really excited at the McKell Institute to be back out and doing things in person again. It's good to be back in Melbourne in the evening talking about ideas and talking about politics. And we think it's fantastic that we're back out doing that again. And we're glad that both people could join us here at the Hill of Content bookshop on Bourke Street in Melbourne for tonight's event, but also for the people who are joining us via Zoom as well. So a bit of best of both worlds, we hope, and that people from right around the country who can't be here in Melbourne because, let's face it, they live in not as good cities, can still engage with the McKell Institute tonight. The other thing I should say is that tonight's interview is being recorded so that it can feature in the Socially Democratic podcast, the podcast run by Stephen Donnelly, who many of you may know. Socially Democratic is a centre-left political podcast that sort of delves into political progressive campaigns and politics with people from around the country and around the world, and we hope that tonight's session and interview with Zoe will be an interesting feature to anyone who's listening in to the podcast in coming weeks. So the format of tonight, we'll do a bit of a Q&A. Basically, I'll do a bit of a discuss the book with Zoe for a little while, then we'll open it up to questions both from the people who are with us here in Melbourne, but also people who are joining us via Zoom from around the country. So get your questions ready. For those of you who are here, there's a glass of wine up the back if you're interested. Make sure you settle in for what it looks like will be a great discussion. Can I begin just by introducing Zoe? So many of you will recognise her from many years on ABC television as a foreign correspondent, Southeast Asia, Africa, 5 years in the US.
Mm-hmm. Close, not
quite close to 5 years in the US, and an enormous amount of time spent looking at the world and looking at politics. And for those of you who had the privilege of reading the book, Greetings from Trumpland, it's her and her co-author Roscoe Whalan's observations of Donald Trump, the campaign, the presidency, and everything that happened from the perspective of people who saw it from the Washington Press Corps. But I think one of the things that was really interesting about the book, and for those who haven't read it yet, I really encourage you to do so, was the insights that Zoe and Roscoe got from people on the road and the voices of the wide range of Americans and how they were processing what was happening in the politics around them. I think it was a really interesting part of the book. So, Zoe, thank you for coming.
Thanks for having me.
Congratulations on a great book.
Thank you.
It seemed like it was, I don't know where to start, Donald Trump, his campaign, the presidency, what happened at the end. It's hard to know what leaps out first. But I thought I'd start by asking, we all saw it from afar. We saw it from the other side of a news service or on Facebook or on Twitter. What was it like? What was the ride like in person?
Relentless, I think, is the main word that I'd use to describe it. Always when you take on a foreign posting, I think you have to assume that from the day that you land in the country to the day that you leave it, you are on duty. So it is a 24/7 job, but this was even more so. There was just no downtime at all. When I took the job as US Bureau Chief in mid-2015, of course, Hillary Clinton was expected to win the election. Donald Trump had just descended the golden escalator. He was seen as a joke candidate. In fact, the Huffington Post, I think, reported it in their entertainment pages, and it really was being framed as just a bit of a sideshow to the campaign. And a few crusty old journos in Sydney said to me as I was leaving, look, it'll be a fun campaign, but it'll probably get pretty boring after Hillary wins. It'll be kind of back to no drama Obama kind of thing. And I was like, oh, yeah, okay. And then once I arrived and started travelling around the US, it became immediately apparent that there was something more going on. Of course, very early in the piece, I headed out to Iowa and the other sort of early primaries and caucuses, and we were in queues of sometimes tens of thousands of people in the snow waiting to see Donald Trump, and then we'd rock up to a Hillary event and there'd be 200 people in a high school basketball gym. Like, it was just a totally different vibe. There was so much momentum on his side of the campaign, and a lot of people just desperate for something different and really disappointed in 8 years of Obama. And for whatever reason, although Donald Trump is far from the everyman, they sort of put their money on him to deliver something to them. And it really did kick off as soon as I landed. I think we arrived on a Saturday night. I was in the office on the Monday, and I kind of didn't really stop working until I left several years later.
At what point during the campaign did you think he was going to win? Because it wasn't conventional wisdom. The pundits all thought that Hillary was home and hosed.
Pretty early. Again, you know, I think that, so my background is I was born in Melbourne, but I grew up in Tasmania. I moved from Tassie to Adelaide to go to university. I started working for ABC Regional Radio. I then became a rural reporter. I presented the Country Hour. So I spent a lot of time out in rural and regional Australia in unfamiliar environments, talking to people about things I had no clue about, especially a lot of farmers, the technicalities of growing broccoli and wheat and stuff like that. And, much as I grew up in a regional city, I'm not a farm girl. And so I've applied that sort of sense of interest in things that I know nothing about, and also talking to people who have very different political views to me, to my international reporting. So Roscoe and myself, I think, really took a position of trying to be outside the major cities as much as possible, to spend as much time as we could speaking to ordinary people, trying to really take the temperature of what they wanted, what they were missing, where their disappointment is. And that runs so deep in the US. I think from here, particularly with Trump, people would see, these crazy grabs that he'd be giving, and you see a very distilled version of actually what's going on. But when you go over there and you sit through entire Trump speeches that go for hours at some of these rock star rallies, or his press conferences, the rambling that goes on for a long time, it's very different. And you can see how some of what he says will resonate with people. And then when you actually go and sit with those people, in their kitchens or, at a high school football game or whatever it is, and sort of get to know them, you get a sense of that they're really looking for something, and that they feel that loss of that American exceptionalism, and they feel that their children will have a worse future than they have had. And so they're trying to sort of find something, and that sort of really just it became so evident following the campaign that there were so many of those people who were just looking to shake up politics. And Donald Trump, in a way, was the perfect storm, the anti-politician, the renegade, who came along at the same time as Hillary, who was the absolute archetypal establishment politician, apart from being a woman, which unfortunately, in that particular perfect storm, was a downside for her too.
I want to come to some of that gender question in a minute. But one of the things that I think strikes me as one of these factors of being fed up with the 8 years of Obama, and even probably the years before that, and something that Trump was able to tap into quite successfully, in stark contrast, I think, to the prevailing orthodoxy in the Republican Party at the time, was about trade, for example, as a symbol of the decline of America's economic might, the decline of American manufacturing and infrastructure. And there's some really interesting passages in the book talking about your experiences in the Rust Belt states, in the towns where people couldn't see where the factories were going to be coming from again, what they weren't going to reopen. This sense of economic dislocation was something that Trump campaigned on. How successful do you think he was in governing to address those factors? And is there anything that we think we can learn here about the way that we need to approach or reapproach some of those sort of economic orthodoxies that have existed in politics in America and in Australia for a very long time?
Yeah, well, I mean, Trump's an arch populist, and he could have been equally a Democrat or a Republican, really. It's just a case of choosing what was going to be the most successful method to winning. And although we talk a lot in the book about his desire for box ticking, he's very keen to have his list of promises to the American people, and then to be able to put a green tick next to each of the ones that he's done, and also to be able to say, also, I did that better than Obama, Bush, Clinton, Reagan, whoever, so I'm the best president ever. But, was he actually seeking to bring about the kind of structural change that was needed, or was it more about being seen to do that for the sake of the popularity? I mean, in many of those Rust Belt areas, there is a sense of blame on things like world trade, or, trade liberalisation, globalisation, particularly cheap labour. And he was able to then mobilise or connect that with xenophobia that is pre-existing, to sort of enable people's thinking that, people from other countries are either coming in and taking their jobs or their jobs are being exported, when obviously a lot of what's going on is to do with the technological revolution and a whole sort of bigger picture. But then, he went into many of those communities and promised, well, I'll bring back your car manufacturing, I'll bring back your factories, and he didn't deliver that. However, when it comes to his trade war with China, for example, we spoke to several farmers of that, a sense of taking it up to the Chinese, of being a bit more bolshy, even though perhaps it was eating into their profits in the first instance. There was an acceptance of short-term pain for long-term gain in those people's minds. So, people were prepared to tolerate things about Donald Trump, both in a sort of structural sense in terms of what policies he could deliver, but also the way he behaves, for the sake of sort of a psyche change, perhaps, sense that he would call things out, that he was direct, that he would, flex muscle for the sake of them.
Giving them a voice that they could recognise in the political and economic debates that they probably felt so distant from for such a long period of time.
Well, yeah, and we talk about America First a lot in the book, and obviously that was very central to what Donald Trump sort of branded himself as. But it also, I think, for a lot of people becomes me first. And I think there's a lot of residual anger now about that. And, I think that's one of the important sort of themes of the book, where you have, even after Donald Trump is now out of office, you have a lot of Democrats or progressives who are really angry with people who voted for Donald Trump, because they sort of have a view that you're bad people. You put this person in office who was not suited to that role, and he, denigrated America in various ways. Therefore, we're not going to deal with you. And that's a sort of very problematic position when it comes to any sort of forward movement in a more social sense rather than political, when you have two such polarised groups of people who just can't deal with each other at all.
Yeah, I think it applies in America, it applies here. The tendency for people in parts of the political class to denigrate the views of voters, I think, is a recipe for disaster in the short term and the long term, because it fails to understand exactly what it is that they're experiencing, and proves yet again that they're disconnected from the lives of people who aren't benefiting as much from the changes that we're seeing in our economy.
Well, if you could to compare Trump voters, and I wouldn't call them Republicans necessarily, but if you to compare Trump voters to Democrats who have that view that you're Trumpites, so you're not worth dealing with, well, the Trumpites would say, well, in 2016, we voted in a democratic process. He won the election. You never accepted it. You then spent that entire administration trying to undermine the democratic process via the Russia probe, impeachment, and various other methods to get him out of office. And then in the minds of those people, they bought the thesis that the election was going to be stolen. So in the end, they feel like their whole side of the democratic process was undermined. And this is kind of what I'm getting at when I talk about looking at things from the opposing point of view to the one that you might assume. Like, if you look at it from those people's point of view, you can see how people might buy that argument. And those people who marched on the Capitol, and I think that's another sort of key theme of the book, that they're not the average Trump voter. They're not the ordinary American who voted for Donald Trump. Those people are not the horned man
fortunately,
who stormed the Capitol. But the people who stormed the Capitol because they believed that the election had been stolen from their president. They stormed the Capitol because they were trying to defend democracy in their minds. Even though if we look at it from the opposite side of the prism, of course, we go, well, that was tearing down democracy. But it's actually emblematic of how polarised that situation is.
I want a good point to sort of talk about delegitimisation of democracy, fake news.
Mm-hmm.
It was a theme and it was a tactic and a tool that Trump used very early and very successfully to undermine his opponents in the direct political sense, but also in the wider cultural sense, the sort of media elites and the like. And that delegitimising of the centres of authority will have some sort of ongoing effect. How widespread was and how effective do you think it was for him to use the cries about fake news, the undermining of democratic or legitimised processes in trying to achieve his political ends?
Oh, it's huge. I mean, I think it's a global revolution in sort of information manipulation, and I think we're falling victim to it here as well. And it's happening all over Southeast Asia and, everywhere you look, Europe, South America. Leaders have realised that if they manipulate information, even very subtly, the public will buy it. A portion of the public will buy it. This is very dangerous, I think. And Trump, he tested this for quite some time. I mean, one thing that we talk about in the book is that, he was quite involved in the birther movement around whether Barack Obama was actually born in the United States. And he realised through that process of testing that thesis what he could get into the mainstream media and how he could manipulate the platform to put forward a false message, and that a portion of the population would buy that. And that also particular parts of the media environment would push this narrative on his behalf. So he used that as a testing ground. And then he continued to deploy that throughout his presidency incredibly effectively. I was at many events where the way that his rock star rallies kind of work is that the media is penned in a sort of gated metal pen in the centre of the stadium and Trump will be on the stage, and then you're surrounded by maybe 20,000 Trump supporters, and then Trump would, in the middle of the thing, say, "That's their fake news right there, everybody." And then you'd have the entire crowd sort of screaming at you. And, in many cases, there were altercations with American journalists. Being Australian it helps a lot, because as soon as you open your mouth, people say, "Oh, you're okay, you're Aussies," and they're quite willing to talk to you. But he utilised this very effectively. It was very deliberate, and in my mind, as Roscoe and I were writing the book, and one thing I've learned while I've been doing international journalism, not only in the US, is that the more things happen and you think that can't possibly happen, the more they continue to happen. Like it sort of dominoes on itself. And so when he got COVID, and then about half the population didn't believe that he had COVID, that was kind of like the coming home of every, seed of doubt that he had sown throughout the presidency, to the point that even when he said he had COVID, people were like, well, maybe he doesn't have it. He's probably just using it to try to make people feel sorry for him. And then he comes out, of course, he beats COVID. So then he's really strong. And, there's all sorts of ways of looking at that. And then, of course, the seeding of the election being stolen is just the most obvious, deliberate strategy to seed that throughout the year of the election, so that obviously when you lose the election, you just go, well, I told you that was going to happen. And a portion of the population then storm the Capitol because they believe that their democratic process has been thwarted. It's so obvious that to be mind-splitting, really, that people bought that.
Yeah. I made a note that in chapter 6, just a comment you made, he rates.
Yeah.
And he clearly does. People tuned in. They wanted to see it. And it's not just on Fox News. It was all the channels all the time, giving him all the coverage that perpetuated this. I want to just touch on briefly a couple of other things. You mentioned earlier about Hillary, and so I think we need to, given what's been happening here in Australia, talk a bit about gender and the sort of way that, I don't know whether it was the first articulation of it in these terms, but the way that Trump weaponised sort of general misogyny against a political opponent. Do you think it was particular about Hillary, or do you think it was part of a broader culture, a broader acceptance of saying things you want to say, but also being willing to let misogyny out of the bag?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's part of his sort of broader enabling of, incivility in regard to gender, race, and sort of what you might describe as generally appropriate behaviour for leaders. However, and he did, he said many toxic things about many women, not just Hillary, but Hillary is a bit of a special case. Because Hillary, it's unfortunate, and as I sort of say, I go back to the perfect storm, that Hillary being you couldn't get a more establishment candidate if you tried, former senator, first lady, secretary of state, and being Bill Clinton's first lady, there's a lot of baggage around Hillary in regard to the Lewinsky scandal. Some women feel that she enabled Bill during that process. So there's sort of this underlying reverse sexism going on there. There is deep lack of trust in Hillary, largely because of her emails, much as that has been, raked over endlessly with no real result. And also the death of the Libyan ambassador when she was Secretary of State. People just don't trust her. And a few things happened, you might say from here, well, she's like the best qualified person to ever run for the presidency, you could argue. But there is so much vitriol towards Hillary. And this, again, when we're travelling around in the so-called flyover states talking to ordinary Americans, a lot of people just hate her. And there were T-shirts. I mean, the most awful sexist T-shirts that people would be just openly walking around with them with Hillary's face on them, with like a picture of Monica, don't blow it, Hill, this kind of stuff. Like, it was just difficult for her. And I think the other problem that Hillary had was that he's a great performer. She is not. She's actually very personable and warm one-on-one. And I've seen her, taking selfies and chatting with people in those small environments. If she's giving a speech, it's like a PowerPoint presentation. You put that up against Donald Trump, that's a very difficult kind of dynamic. And then, like, I talk about a dinner that I went to at the Australian Ambassador's residence with Madeleine Albright, and I made a comment that Hillary had a big trust problem because people just don't like her, and this was when there was a thing circulating about the fact that she wouldn't release the speeches that she'd given to various large corporate organisations in New York, and she'd been paid a lot of money for these speaking events. And that, it seems like a small thing, but that sort of became a big thing for many of those people in small town America. What's she hiding? What's she telling them that she's not telling us? Why are they special? Why are they more special than us? She's making a lot of money out of this, all that sort of thing. And when I mentioned that to Madeleine Albright, she was not very impressed with me. But I sort of came away from that conversation thinking, well, the Democrats don't want to hear this. And that was a problem. Yeah.
At the moment, we've got the trial of George Floyd's alleged killer, Derek Chauvin, proceeding on at the moment. It was obviously the Black Lives Matter movement, George Floyd's death, obviously played a huge role in shaping last year and the election result. Can you talk a bit about your sort of observations of the lead up to that movement and that moment and the way it impacted on the politics of last year?
Yeah, well, I think, I have mixed feelings about what happened last year in the sense that I still feel like it's like that conversation, that every time an African-American man gets killed by a police officer, we have this explosion of anger and attention on the issue, and then it goes away again, and then it happens again. Like it's just repeating. However, I do think that while Trump, I think in many ways enabled racists, and particularly in a very concerning way, the sort of white supremacy scene. It also enabled people to come out against racism in a much stronger way, and therefore brought attention to that issue in a much stronger way. And I think, Me Too is another example of that maybe that whole Me Too movement would have happened when it did anyway, but the fact that it happened during the era of Trump, it just gave it that extra edge, that extra level of attention because, people could see how he was enabling misogyny, and therefore it sort of gave it a lot more currency. So, I do watch what's happening with Black Lives Matter and think, as a journalist, unfortunately, I think we're in this sort of washing machine cycle of news where the cycle's so quick now that it's like what happened yesterday is nothing because everyone's focused on what's happening today. And then if you're Trump, you just sort of throw a grenade over there and then everyone turns that way. One thing that's interesting with this latest iteration of Black Lives Matter is that it's continuing. And so, it's a very slow progression. But each step forward is a step forward.
Yeah. There's a lot that I want to get to, but I'm not going to take up all of the time just with things that I want to talk about. So I thought I might ask if there are questions that we've got. I've got some people putting questions into the Zoom chat. So if you're joining us online, please feel free to put a question into Zoom. The magic of technology is making them appear on my phone in front of me, which is remarkable. So people who are joining us online, please continue to do that. I might start with one of those questions from Para. And you mentioned it a little bit before, but she's asked about the role played by Fox News in hoisting Trump. Can you talk a little bit about we don't sort of have that powerful presence in the Australian media market as Fox News. What was it really like as a shaper of news, and also how do you think Trump leveraged it to his success?
Yeah, well, I mean, Fox News was already a shaper of news before Trump, and you could say, well, it was a chicken or egg. I mean, Fox News latched onto Trump because Trump rates, which we've already talked about, and Fox News wasn't the only one. I mean, CNN, MSNBC, everyone had Trump wall to wall during 2015 and 16 until he won the election. And really during the first half of the presidency, it only started to taper off probably once the public started getting bored with it, that they stopped taking every word that came out of Trump's mouth live. But it's to do with the framing, because obviously Fox News were, hero worshipping Trump for much of his administration, and in an incredibly partisan media environment of 300 plus million people, it's very different to here because you only watch, listen to or read what you already believe. So it's like the sort of outrage television consumption environment where you watch Fox News and you get fed exactly what you want to hear, and you get told that the other side are doing the wrong thing and undermining your leader, and that then, increases the outrage, so it just feeds on itself. And then if you're watching CNN, you get the opposite to that, but people still watch it. It's just a factor of the 24/7 media environment that is not necessarily a positive thing. And one thing that has happened that we talk about a bit in the book is that Fox News is now no longer extreme enough for many Trump supporters, who are now watching Newsmax or OAN or, much more fringe media organisations that are starting to come into the mainstream, because, there was even a bit of pushback from Fox towards the end. So I think that's very concerning, because it's a question of, well, how do you get those people back? If we talk about our sort of reducing capacity to have conversations with each other just as a society, and the fact that we all get on social media and argue with each other about, the most minor things, how do you, if your leaders or political parties bring people back from the edge of the abyss and have a conversation with them, even if you don't agree with them? How does Joe Biden, now that he's there, talk to those people who are watching Newsmax or OAN? Does he just accept that they're lost? And then, therefore, what happens in 2024? Because, 74 million people voted for Donald Trump, and they haven't just gone away. In fact, in my mind, that's probably building. And it will be very dependent on what Biden can deliver over his presidency.
Sounds like you just read the question that came through in the chat. I'm not kidding. Is there anyone in the audience who's got a question they want to put to Zoe? Kelvin?
So he seemed to tap into, you talked about ratings and his ability to be front and centre with the media. He seemed to have a particular magic around seeing politics as entertainment and being able to entertain people and attract a support by that approach. Is that, do you see that as a one-off? I know he has a huge following now, and you say it's building, but is that politics as entertainment a one-off, or do you see that as just as extending internationally with this sort of more populist view of political debate?
Well, I think The Rock said yesterday that he would be willing to run for the presidency. So, and, Kanye was an option at one point. And there was a meeting between him and Trump in the Oval Office at one point, which was completely off the wall. But anyway, it's difficult to replicate someone like Trump. I think that's fact. And he's a reality TV guy. He learned a lot through that, who his market is, how to get an audience. So then those who want to try to copy that have to test whether they can push those buttons and pull those strings. One thing that we mentioned in the book is that a profile that I did of Cory Bernardi when he was over doing a stint at the UN, and the fact that Bernardi then came back here and launched his Australian Conservatives or whatever it was called, which went nowhere. And we kind of reflect on the fact that, well, I guess it shows that it's difficult to achieve Trumpism when you don't have Trump. So, like, you can adopt some of the elements of Trumpism, but you still have to have that figurehead. And, I mean, many leaders around the world have adopted elements of Trumpism with varying success. Bolsonaro in Brazil is probably the most obvious example, and some in Europe. But, if you look at the Australian situation, and I definitely think our politicians are employing elements of Trumpism, but we have some protection here because we have a Westminster system. So we don't have a sort of top-down presidential election. We don't have the Electoral College. It's not as personality-based because it's party political. So, with all of those things, I mean, I think the point is that it has to be the right person. And then how do you find that that person? Are they just sort of a once in a generation phenomenon? But I do find it very interesting how many politicians the world over have adopted his strategies, fake news probably being the most obvious one.
Any other? Kath?
It's a little bit to that. I worry if COVID didn't happen, could Trump have still won? Because one of the things that fake news actually did was affect the way that his population didn't follow advice and didn't trust advice, and therefore he killed quite a lot of them through that. And I think some of that's why Fox ditched him a bit.
Yeah. So
had he not contributed to the deaths of so many of his supporters, or perhaps not his supporters because they have particular demographic attributes as well, but had that not happened, 70 million still voted for him.
Yes.
So,
well, look, in my mind,
has it turned as a result? Has some of that been a bit irretrievable since COVID, or is it still possible for him and his supporters to turn it back around?
Well, if you had asked me in February last year, I would have said 100% he was walking into a second term, no question. The thing that happened was that he lost control of the narrative for the first time because of a pandemic. So it took a global pandemic, really, to bring him down. Otherwise, he would have won, in my mind, for sure. And the second thing I would say is that it's not necessarily those who supported him turning against him that won him the election. It was the motivation on the other side to get out and vote in the country where there's not compulsory voting, in spite of, the very weird circumstances of voting amid the pandemic. So, if you look at those numbers of, 81 million-ish have voted for Biden, record number, but another 74 million have voted for Trump. If it wasn't for the pandemic, those Democrats, there wouldn't have been as many motivated Democrats. I think we can assume that. Would there have been enough to have won him the election? Well, debatable. But then, 4 years is quite a long time. So one of my questions is around Biden in regard to 2024 is, can he sustain the yay, Biden fixed the COVID situation through to 2024? And does that sustain for the Democrats if Biden doesn't run for a second term and it's all the sticks are thrown back up into the air? And I think it's very interesting in that context that Biden is, I think rightly, jumping into a whole lot of other areas like infrastructure and healthcare, so that he's building a far bigger sort of context on which people would vote at the next election, not just COVID.
It's very hard to sustain voters' enthusiasm for you doing a good job 4 years ago as being a motivating factor to get them to not turn out to vote, let alone vote for you, which for those of us in politics here have experienced repeatedly. I had a question from the Zoom from Christina, and it sort of relates to this question, is that do you think the establishment has learned any enduring lessons from the Trump experience, or will the election of Joe Biden, another long-term establishment figure, arguably one of the most establishment figures that we've seen in US politics for a long time, mean a return to sort of business as usual for all of those inside the Beltway?
I think it's difficult to teach establishment politicians things, not just in the US. I think it requires an injection of new blood, not just there, but everywhere. So that's sort of one thing that I would say. I think what's worth watching, though, is the Republican Party and the schism there. Because what is the Republican Party? It's, 74 million Trump voters and then a whole lot of moderate Republicans, and they're two very different groups. So how does the GOP keep those people in the tent? I don't know how you do that, especially when I think the Republicans have been exposed as having pretty thin policies over the last little while. I mean, they had an opportunity to reform Obamacare under Trump, and they didn't actually have an alternative policy, having been trying to bring down Obamacare for, since it was implemented. Yeah. So there's a real schism in the Republican Party, and I think, there's an evolution going on there that, we may be very old by the time we can look back on it and go, that was kind of the start of a huge change in American party politics, because the Republicans then evolved into something else. But I think the next
phase of the sort of realignment that occurred, sort of post-Nixon, post-Reagan in the South.
Where does it go? But I think also the other thing that's worth noting, and I think it's happening in Australia too, is that you've got this schism in the Democrats, where you've got inner city professionals and blue-collar workers, and the blue-collar workers who would have been union workers who would have always voted Democrat are now voting Republican. So there's a shift happening there too. So, there's a lot going on in terms of the evolution of left and right, so-called.
That's right. I mean, if you look at the last state and federal elections here in Victoria, where, significant swings against Labor in the outer west and outer north, and bigger swings coming back to Labor, particularly at the state election in the east.
Yeah.
And that's telling us, I think, a similar thing here as occurred in the US, and something that people in progressive politics in Australia need to be very mindful of, I think.
Well, and if you look at something like climate policy, just as an example, which, Obama had made some reasonable strides on renewable energy, for example. Trump, in effect, dismantled that. Biden then came into the campaign with, this as a signature policy, that he was going to really tackle climate. That scared the hell out of a lot of blue-collar workers who really feared how that would affect their industries. And however, it builds votes in amongst the professional set in the cities. So, that's just one example of how, if you're managing election campaigns and parties, how you try to cater for all of those different views.
Yeah. Any other questions you've got on the floor?
I'm interested in your observations about the position of the United States internationally. Biden coming in has changed their kind of direction and their language in terms of the US and the world quite sharply. Is it possible to kind of swing the ship around in terms of the way that the US interacts in the world, or are they kind of differently positioned forever after Trump?
Yeah, I don't know, because like my friends in the sort of defence sphere or the military side would say nothing really changed, although, there was a lot of chatter happening at the political level. The interactions from military to military remain solid and stable. However, I do think that Trump's interactions with particularly European leaders probably made several European countries fundamentally rethink their relationship with the US. Like, how much do we need them? How solid is that relationship? What if we don't have them? To me, it just sparks a thought process in the leadership of those countries that may not have happened otherwise. And therefore, maybe it makes them put in some safety nets or create some different thinking that they wouldn't have otherwise had. And it's also been sort of posed to me that the Democrats are more sort of Atlantic facing, where the Republicans are more Pacific facing. So from our perspective, from an Australian perspective, I think that's really worth watching. Like, how much will we see of the Biden administration in regard to doing stuff in Asia? And particularly given the ructions between Trump and the Chinese, there's an opportunity potentially for Biden to actually step into that relationship with China. Like, it could end up being quite a positive window that he has there. But if he's all focused on Europe, then that window will close.
We're running out of time. One last question from the chat before I wrap it up. And this is a sort of couched in the reflections of America and schisms and in the context in the chat, it was civil war. But how on the brink do you think the US is from having some irreversible schisms in between parts of the country? They've held it together for a while, but they do have a history of not holding it together quite as well.
Yeah.
How real do you think it is that there are these schisms?
Yeah, I mean, look, plenty of people have said to me, a civil war is coming. Like, I'm talking about those ordinary people that we've met in inland America. And we know that there are organisations or, small groups of renegades that are armed and sort of ready to act, for example, if the federal government decides to take away state power or those sorts of things. So those sort of militias do exist. And I think what we saw in regard to the storming of the Capitol, some people sort of saw that as the leading edge of what could happen in the US. And I think I come at that a little bit having worked a lot in developing countries and particularly in times of crisis, where it's become apparent to me that a lot of our constructs of society that we rely on and that we think are really solid, things like law and order, particularly in government and institutions, once you push on them, they actually fall over quite quickly. But then the question becomes, how quickly can they pop back up? If you're in a natural disaster environment, for example, which I have been many times, and one comes to mind when I was in the Philippines after a terrible typhoon, and the city had been flattened, and many people after several days hadn't received any food, water, or shelter, and the government was just completely overwhelmed. And of course, what happened was looting. Militias sprung up. People just sort of took control of their own existence because they had no choice, and it's very difficult to actually rein that in. But I think one thing that happened after the storming of the Capitol was that although it fell over quite easily because they were obviously fundamentally unprepared, it actually popped up quite well. And in the end, democracy did prevail because Trump did go and Biden is now the president, and also Trump had his Twitter taken away. So that's where we're at.
Yeah.
But I do think that there's huge anger. There's on both sides. There's a lot of dissatisfaction. And the basic problem is that the two sides do not talk to each other at all. And until people in society with polarised views can start having conversations again, it becomes very difficult to actually work through what those disagreements are. And I feel that if there's one challenge facing the Biden administration, one really core challenge, it is that. And I don't know how you address that.
The resilience of democracy was where I was going to wrap it up. And really anything that you think from your observations that the US could do, and I suppose from our perspective, what you think Australian democracy could do to build its resilience in the face of forces that might like to shake it. What do you think? What do you think are some of those steps that we could take to sort of strengthen the democratic systems and institutions that we've got?
Yeah, well, I think talk to each other more, use social media less, rebuild regional media organisations. I think one void that we have, and this is really stark in the US, but also here, is if you suck all of the local media out of communities, people don't get local news and information. They don't know what's actually happening around them, and they revert only to what's happening at the federal or national debate, and all that is an argument. Yeah. And they lose all the nuance of this is how this infrastructure policy is going to lead to a bridge in my town, and this will, help my chicken farm or whatever it is. All the subtlety of that is lost, and all of those communications and conversations that can happen through regional and local media organisations are really important. So I think that's one key thing. And the other thing from my point of view is just getting more fresh and interesting people into leadership structures so that you have a diversity of views, and you start to erode that establishment politics that's becoming entrenched the world over.
All right. Well, we might leave it there. Zoe, thanks so much for coming tonight, for sharing these insights. It's both been a really interesting read, partly trip down memory lane, part anxiety-inducing, to be honest, about sort of the future of American democracy. But I think there's a lot of lessons there for what's happening here in Australia as well, that I think those of us who are interested in politics in general, but particularly in Australia, need to learn and think about as we take it forward. So please join me in thanking Zoe Daniel.